She was 19 years old, alone, and sleeping behind a feed store when the man who had raised her told the whole town she was a thief and shut his door against her for good. That man was Otis Pruitt, her late mother's second husband, and the reason he gave was a missing brooch that he himself had likely sold to a drummer passing through the month before. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her one good skirt, a tin cup, and a Bible with her mother's name written inside the cover in fading ink. When the stage line auctioned off its retired equipage behind the depot that autumn, she spent 40 of the only dollars she had, money she'd saved scrubbing floors at the boarding house, on a stagecoach so old and sun-cracked that the auctioneer nearly refused to sell it, calling it kindling with wheels. She told herself it was shelter, nothing more, a roof with walls that happened to roll. She did not know, could not have known, that beneath the worn leather of the driver's boot, sealed in a compartment built by a careful hand 40 years before, lay a secret that had been waiting the better part of 2 decades to be found. A secret that would not only give her back her name, but would give an entire town back its conscience. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Voss. If you have ever felt like the world had written you off as worthless, like something left to rot behind a feed store, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Adelaide Voss had been born in 1862 in a soddy house on the Kansas plains, the only daughter of a woman named Constance Voss, who had come west from Ohio with a husband who did not survive the second winter, and who had raised her daughter afterward on a diet of hard work, harder honesty, and the particular tenderness of a woman who had nothing else to give but attention. Constance took in mending and later kept books for the dry goods store in the town of Larkspur Hollow, a modest crossroads settlement that had grown up around a stage line stop on the route between Abilene and the western forts, back when the stagecoach was still the only way west that didn't require a man's own 2 legs and a great deal of faith. It was from her mother that Adelaide learned to read a ledger the way some girls learn to read a hymnal, with reverence and with the understanding that the numbers, properly kept, never lied even when the people around them did. Constance used to say that a column of figures was the most honest conversation a person could have, because numbers did not flatter you and did not betray you, not if you wrote them down true. She taught Adelaide her letters with a stick in the dirt before she taught her with a pencil on paper, because paper was dear and dirt was free, and she taught her, too, the quieter lesson that ran underneath all the others, that worth was not loud. That a thing or a person could sit overlooked in a corner for years, gathering dust, and still be exactly as valuable as it had always been, waiting only for someone patient enough to look closely. Adelaide grew up watching the stagecoaches roll through Larkspur Hollow on their long hauls west, and she came to know the drivers by name the way other girls knew their cousins, Mr. Bellwether, who whistled hymns through his teeth, and young Sam Tatum, who once let her sit up on the box beside him for half a mile while her mother pretended not to notice. She loved the coaches not for any romance in them but for their order, the way every strap and buckle had a purpose, the way the boot beneath the driver's seat was packed with a logic that took a man years to learn. The mail sorted one way, the strongbox wedged just so, the spare traces coiled exactly where a cold hand could find them in the dark. She did not know then that this same intimate knowledge of a stagecoach's hidden architecture would, many years later, be the very thing that saved her life twice over. When Adelaide was 11, her mother began keeping company with a widower named Otis Pruitt, a heavy-set man who ran the livery and who courted Constance with a kind of careful, watchful courtesy that struck Adelaide even then as a performance rather than a feeling, though she could not have named it so at the time. Constance married him in 1875, mostly, Adelaide came to believe later, for the security of it. A roof that did not depend on the dry goods store staying solvent, a name that carried weight in a town where a widow and her daughter were always one bad season from ruin. For a few years the arrangement held. Otis was not unkind, only indifferent, the way a man is indifferent to furniture that has always been in the room. Adelaide kept her mother's habits close. She learned the livery's books as a girl learns a chore, kept herself useful, kept herself quiet, and told herself that quiet was a kind of safety. It was a lesson that would later prove only half true, but at 17, when her mother died of a fever that took half the county that terrible spring, it was the only lesson Adelaide had left to lean on, and she leaned on it hard. The fall, when it came slowly and then all at once, the way Adelaide's mother had always said real trouble did. With Constance gone, Otis Pruitt's patience for his stepdaughter thinned by the season, the way a man's patience thins for an obligation he never truly chose. He kept Adelaide on at the livery for 2 more years, mostly because she did the work of a bookkeeper and a stable hand both for the price of a roof and a bowl of beans, and because letting her go outright would have looked poorly to a town that still remembered Constance with affection. But affection, Adelaide learned, was a currency that spent out fast once the person who'd earned it was in the ground. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns so often does, with money that went missing from the livery strongbox, $11 taken sometime over a Sunday when the office stood empty, and with a brooch of Constance's, a small garnet thing of no great value except sentiment, which vanished from the dresser drawer not long after. Adelaide had not touched either. She would have staked her life on it, and in a manner of speaking, she did. But Otis Pruitt, who had debts of his own that Adelaide did not yet understand and would not understand for some time, needed a name to attach to the loss, and his stepdaughter's name was the cheapest one available to him. He told the sheriff he suspected her. He did not press formal charges, there was no proof, and even Otis was not so far gone as to manufacture proof outright, but he told the men at the feed store and the women at church sociables that he could no longer trust what was his under his own roof, and a man does not need to press charges when a town is willing to convict on suspicion alone. Adelaide was put out of the only home she had left with a carpet bag, $11 sewn into her hem from her last wages, and a reputation she had done nothing to deserve, in the autumn of 1881, 3 weeks shy of her 19th birthday. She spent the first nights behind the feed store because the overhang kept off the worst of the wind, and because Mr. Halloran, who owned it, was kind enough not to chase her off so long as she kept herself tidy and gone before he opened in the morning. She took in mending, the same trade her mother had once leaned on, though in a town that had already decided what to think of her, mending work came slow and suspicious, women handing her their torn hems with the particular wariness of people who believed they might be robbed by the seamstress herself. It was in those weeks, cold and proud and frightened in roughly equal measure, that Adelaide heard the stage line was shuttering its Larkspur Hollow stop for good. The railroad had finally laid track close enough that the old coach route was no longer worth running, and the company was selling off its rolling stock at auction rather than haul it elsewhere. 6 coaches, all of them aged out of regular service, going for whatever scrap value a buyer would offer. Adelaide went to the auction not because she meant to bid but because watching the coaches she had grown up beside get hauled away for parts felt like watching a second mother get buried, and she wanted at least to be present for it. The newest coaches went to ranchers wanting wagon frames for $40 and $50 apiece. But there was one coach nobody wanted at all, a high-built old Concord-style body, its paint long since sun-bleached to the color of bone, one door hanging on a single hinge, the leather thorough braces beneath it cracked and sagging so badly that the whole carriage sat tilted like a tired old man leaning on a cane. The auctioneer, a brisk fellow named Crabtree who'd clearly priced it to simply be rid of it, opened the bidding at $5 and got nothing but laughter for his trouble. Adelaide, listening to the men around her call it junk, kindling, firewood with wheels, felt something rise in her that she did not entirely understand even as it moved her hand into the air. She bid $10. Then, when a rancher half-heartedly bid $15 just to be ornery, she bid $40, every dollar she had left in this world beyond a few coins, in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. The crowd went quiet in the particular way crowds go quiet when they've decided to feel sorry for someone. Crabtree, looking at her carefully, said the coach was hers and asked, not unkindly, what in the world a girl alone meant to do with it. Adelaide told him she meant to live in it, which was true, and which was also, she would later understand, the smallest part of the truth of why she had bought it at all. They towed the coach out to a scrubby half-acre at the edge of town that nobody had bothered to fence, a forgotten triangle of land between the old stage road and a dry creek bed, and left it tilted in the buffalo grass like a wrecked ship run aground. Adelaide spent her first night in it wrapped in her one blanket, listening to the wind worry at the loose door, and woke the next morning with a fierce, almost defiant determination to make the thing livable rather than simply endure it. She swept it out. She found a farmer willing to trade a few hours of mending for enough scrap canvas to patch the worst gap in the roof. She pried up the floorboards to scrub out years of dust and mouse leavings, working with the careful methodical patience her mother had taught her over a ledger book, treating the coach not as a ruin but as a puzzle that simply hadn't yet revealed its better nature. It was on the 4th day, working her fingers along the underside of the driver's boot, that deep leather and wood compartment beneath the driver's seat where the mail and strongbox had always ridden, that she noticed something that did not belong. A seam in the wood that ran a hair too straight, a panel that gave very slightly, under the pressure of her thumb in a way solid old oak had no business giving. She had spent enough of her childhood watching drivers load and unload that boot to know its ordinary architecture by heart, and this was not ordinary. Heart suddenly loud in her ears, she worked her fingers along the seam until she found the catch, a small iron tongue gone stiff with rust, and when she pressed it, the false panel came away in her hand to reveal a narrow hidden cavity built into the boot's true floor, a space no bigger than a bread box but a space, unmistakably, that someone had built on purpose and hidden on purpose and never come back for. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, Adelaide found a leather dispatch pouch stamped with the old stage company's mark, and inside that, a folded set of papers so carefully preserved that even after what must have been close to 20 years sealed in that dark space, the ink had barely faded. There was a driver's manifest dated to a run in the autumn of 1863, listing a strongbox shipment of company payroll bound for the fort, along with a separate, unofficial letter folded inside the manifest in a different hand entirely, cramped, hurried, the writing of a man working by poor light in a hurry. The letter was addressed to no one by name, only to whoever finds this if God is good, and it took Adelaide 3 readings, sitting frozen on the floor of the coach with the dust motes turning gold in a shaft of afternoon light, before she understood what she was holding. The letter was a confession, written by a driver named Jeremiah Coates, a name Adelaide did not recognize, but one she would soon learn that half of Larkspur Hollow remembered all too well, admitting that the famous robbery of the Larkspur Hollow stage payroll in 1863, a robbery that had been blamed for 20 years on a hired hand named Ezra Lund, had in truth been an inside theft committed by the stage line's own regional agent at the time, a man named Hollis Drummond, who had forced Coates at gunpoint to help stage the appearance of a holdup, then murdered Coates's testimony, so to speak, by spreading word that the unfortunate Ezra Lund, a black freedman who had been hired on as a stock tender and had no one in town to vouch loudly for him, had done the deed and fled. Lund had in fact fled, the letter explained, not from guilt but from fear, knowing exactly what kind of justice a man like him could expect in a frontier town eager for a name to hang the blame on, and Coates, ashamed and frightened and complicit by his own silence, had hidden the manifest and his confession in the one place he trusted no one to look, inside the coach itself, meaning to retrieve it and make things right once he found the courage. He never had. The letter ended with a line that Adelaide read so many times in the weeks that followed that she came to know it by heart, that a wrong left unspoken does not heal itself with time, it only waits, the way the coach itself had waited, for someone patient enough to come looking. The deepening of the mystery did not happen all at once but unfolded the way a long-buried root system reveals itself only when you start, carefully, to dig. Adelaide took her find first not to the sheriff, whom she did not entirely trust given how readily he had once entertained Otis Pruitt's suspicions of her, but to the one person in Larkspur Hollow who had always treated her with a steady, unromantic kindness untouched by the town's gossip. Reverend Asa Whitfield, an elderly circuit preacher who had buried her mother and who kept, in the back room of the chapel, a set of county newspapers going back further than most people in town had bothered to remember existed. Together, over the course of several careful afternoons, Adelaide and the Reverend pieced together what had become of everyone the letter named. Hollis Drummond, the agent who had orchestrated the original theft, had used the stolen payroll money, it turned out, to buy up failing claims around Larkspur Hollow in the years just after the robbery, quietly building the very foundation of what was now the town's largest landholding and cattle operation. An operation that, Adelaide learned with a chill that ran straight down to her boots, was now run by Drummond's son, Garrett Drummond, a man widely respected in town, a deacon at the very church whose back room held the newspapers proving his father's fortune had been built on theft and a stolen man's ruined name. As for Ezra Lund, the freedman blamed for the crime he hadn't committed, the newspapers traced his flight north and then, heartbreakingly, his death some 12 years later in a railroad accident in Nebraska, listed in a brief item as an unidentified Negro laborer, no kin notified, no name even printed, a final erasure layered on top of the first. He had left behind, the Reverend discovered through a contact at a Nebraska parish, a widow and a young daughter who had eventually settled in a town not 3 days' ride from Larkspur Hollow, never knowing that the husband and father who had supposedly stolen a payroll and abandoned them had in truth been an innocent man running for his life from a crime someone else had committed. Adelaide sat with this knowledge the way she imagined her mother might have sat with a column of figures that simply would not balance, turning it over for the plain, hard truth underneath. It would have been easy, even reasonable, to feel that the discovery had nothing to do with her own ruined name, her own unjust exile from Otis Pruitt's house. But she felt, with a conviction that surprised her in its strength, that it had everything to do with it. She herself had been disbelieved on the word of a man with something to hide. She herself had been made to carry a shame that belonged, rightly, to someone else. To find proof, sitting in her own 2 hands, that this exact injustice had happened before, on a larger and crueler scale, and had simply been left to calcify into the bedrock of the town's most respected family, lit something in her that her grief and her cold nights behind the feed store had not quite managed to light. Not just the desire to be believed, but the conviction that the truth, once found, was owed to someone besides herself. The trouble, of course, was that the truth Adelaide now held threatened to dismantle the standing of the single most powerful man in Larkspur Hollow, and powerful men, she would learn over the following weeks, did not go quietly. Word travels in small towns the way water travels through soil, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly it is everywhere at once, and it was not long before Garrett Drummond learned, through channels Adelaide never fully traced, that the destitute girl living in the old coach out by the dry creek had been asking pointed questions at the chapel about events from 20 years past. Drummond came to her himself one gray afternoon, dressed in the unhurried good clothes of a man who had never once had to worry where his next meal was coming from, and he was at first almost gentle about it, the way a man is gentle when he believes gentleness will be cheaper than confrontation. He suggested that old scandals served no one, that his late father's name and his own good standing had done a great deal of practical good for the town. The new schoolhouse, the bridge repair, the relief fund after the hailstorm 2 summers back, and that a girl with Adelaide's own reputation, fair or not, would find herself believed by exactly no one if she tried to spend it accusing a deacon of the church on the strength of papers she claimed, with suspicious convenience, to have found in a coach nobody else had thought worth $40. It was not a threat, not exactly, but the shape of one sat plainly underneath his pleasant words, and Adelaide understood, listening to him, that she was being offered a door back into respectability if only she would agree to stay quiet, and shown, just as clearly, what would happen to what little standing she still had if she did not. She did not answer him that day beyond a few careful non-committal words, because she had learned, watching her mother manage Otis Pruitt's moods for years, that the wisest response to a man testing your resolve was rarely to hand him your resolve on the spot. But the pressure did not stop with Drummond's visit. Within the week, the farmer who had been trading her mending work for scraps of food found reasons to send less business her way. The sheriff, a tired, cautious man named Purdy who Adelaide suspected wanted nothing so much as to avoid trouble before his retirement, came by the coach to suggest, in a roundabout fashion, that a young woman without people or property might find herself moved along if she kept stirring up old business that respectable folks would rather let lie. Even Reverend Whitfield, though he never once asked her to abandon the truth, grew visibly uneasy, torn between his loyalty to honesty and his awareness of exactly how much of the church roof's recent repair had been paid for by Drummond family donations. Adelaide understood in those weeks what it meant to be genuinely, structurally alone against a man with money and standing both, and she understood too with a clarity that frightened her, that if she did nothing, the town would simply close back over this secret the way water closes over a dropped stone, and Ezra Lund's name would stay buried under a lie for another 20 years, and another 20 after that, for as long as there was a Drummond left standing to benefit from the silence. What turned the tide was not a confrontation but a piece of careful, patient work that Adelaide undertook the way her mother had taught her to undertake any difficult column of figures, by refusing to be rushed, and by gathering enough separate, corroborating truths that no single threat could make the whole structure collapse. She wrote, with the Reverend's help, to the Nebraska parish that had recorded Ezra Lund's death, and received back a brief, devastating reply confirming the details and including, almost as an afterthought, the name and last known location of his widow, a woman named Hester Lund, and their daughter, now grown, named Naomi. She tracked down 2 other elderly residents of Larkspur Hollow, a retired blacksmith and a woman who had worked as a maid in the Drummond house in the years just after the robbery, who, once they understood that someone else already possessed real evidence and was not simply fishing for gossip, were willing to confirm small, telling details. The blacksmith remembered Hollis Drummond buying up failing claims with suspicious speed and suspicious cash not long after the robbery, the former maid. Remembered, distantly, a strong box kept in the elder Drummond's study that she had always found odd for a man who claimed no banking business of his own. None of these fragments alone would have convicted anyone of anything. Together, laid out beside Jeremiah Coates's confession and the original manifest, they formed a picture too coherent, too internally consistent, for any reasonable person to dismiss as the fantasy of a friendless girl with a grudge. Adelaide brought everything she had gathered not to the sheriff first and not to Garrett Drummond, but to a meeting of the town council that she requested, with quiet and unshakable formality, through the council clerk, a meeting that several members tried initially to delay or deny her until Reverend Whitfield, finding his own courage at last, stood beside her and insisted publicly that the town owed any citizen the right to be heard. On the night of the meeting, the small council room in the back of the dry goods store filled fuller than anyone could remember, half the town having heard some twisted version of the rumor already and come either to defend Drummond or simply to see what would happen. Adelaide stood before them in her one good skirt, the same skirt that had once carried $11 hidden across a hard season, and read Jeremiah Coates's confession aloud in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as she had feared it would, laid the original 1863 manifest on the table for any man present to examine in his own hands, and then, item by item, walked the room through the corroborating testimony she had gathered, ending with the quiet, devastating fact that Ezra Lund, the man the whole town had spent 2 decades calling a thief and a coward who ran, had in fact died poor and unidentified in a railroad accident in Nebraska, leaving behind a widow and daughter who to this day believed their husband and father had abandoned them in disgrace rather than fled to save his own life from a lie that powerful men had told to protect themselves. Garrett Drummond, present in the room, tried at first to dismiss the whole account as the desperate fabrication of a girl with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to be careful with, but his composure cracked visibly when the elderly maid, seated near the back, confirmed in her own plain words what she remembered of the strongbox in his father's study, and cracked further still when Adelaide produced, last of all, a final line from Coates's letter naming the exact ravine off the old fort road where Coates had claimed the staged hold-up site had been deliberately disturbed to look like a robbery, a detail that 2 of the older men in the room, who had ridden out as part of the original posse in 1863, suddenly and uncomfortably recalled, matching the actual terrain far better than the official story ever had. The justice that followed was not the dramatic, courtroom kind so much as the slow, grinding, entirely real kind that small towns mete out once shame finally outweighs convenience. Garrett Drummond did not go to prison. The original crime had been his father's, committed and confessed by a man 2 decades dead, and the law had little appetite for punishing a son for a father's theft, however much that theft had built his present fortune. But the council, shaken and humbled in roughly equal measure, voted that night to formally clear Ezra Lund's name in the town record, an act that meant more to Adelaide than any punishment could have, and pressed Garrett Drummond, under the plain weight of public shame and the threat of a civil suit the original payroll's rightful heirs might well bring, to make restitution. Drummond, to his limited credit, chose not to fight the tide once it had clearly turned against him. He agreed, in a settlement brokered awkwardly but sincerely by Reverend Whitfield, to fund a proper monument and a small trust in Ezra Lund's name, and, at Adelaide's specific and quietly insistent request, to provide a sum to Hester and Naomi Lund sufficient to settle whatever debts and hardships 20 years of believed disgrace had cost them. Not as charity, Adelaide made certain the language stated, but as restitution owed. As for Otis Pruitt, his small, mean injustice against Adelaide came undone almost as an afterthought of the larger reckoning. Once the town had watched one respected man's reputation collapse under the weight of one honest girl's evidence, several people who had quietly never quite believed Otis's old story about the missing brooch and the $11 found their courage to say so aloud, and the drummer who had purchased a garnet brooch from Otis Pruitt the autumn after Constance's death was, through Reverend Whitfield's careful inquiries, eventually located and persuaded to confirm exactly where he'd gotten it. Otis never publicly apologized, men like him rarely do, but he left Larkspur Hollow within the year, his credit at the bank quietly withdrawn, his standing gone the way standing goes when a town finally remembers what it had chosen, for convenience, to forget. Adelaide used a portion of the funds that came her way, modest as they were, not to leave the dry creek and the coach behind but to make the half-acre genuinely her own at last, purchasing the land outright from the town for a fair price and building, slow season by slow season, a small honest house beside the old coach rather than instead of it, because she found, once the dust had settled, that she could not bring herself to abandon the thing that had given her back so much. She kept books for the dry goods store much as her mother once had, and later for half the merchants in town, because a girl who could find a 20-year-old theft hidden in the floorboards of an old stagecoach was, people quickly decided, exactly the sort of person you wanted looking at your figures. She wrote to Hester and Naomi Lund and, in time, welcomed them for a visit to Larkspur Hollow that the whole town turned out for with a mixture of shame and genuine welcome, standing together at the modest stone marker the council had raised at last with Ezra Lund's true name and the truth of what had happened to him carved into it for anyone, ever after, to read. It was Naomi Lund, in fact, standing beside Adelaide at that unveiling, who said the thing Adelaide came back to often in the years afterward, that her father had spent his whole short remaining life believing the world had decided he was worth nothing, and that it had taken a girl the world had also decided was worth nothing to prove, finally, that the world had simply been wrong about them both. Adelaide thought of her mother's old saying about the honesty of numbers, about how a thing's true value never actually changes no matter how many years it sits ignored in a corner gathering dust. And she understood, standing there, that this was the truest accounting she had ever helped complete. Not dollars and cents but a man's name returned to its rightful column after 20 years in the wrong one. She had been 19 and homeless, sleeping behind a feed store on the word of a man who wanted a cheap excuse to be rid of her, when she spent the whole of what she had left in the world on a stagecoach that the rest of the town had called fit only for kindling. She had bought it, if she was honest with herself even now, half out of grief and half out of simple stubbornness, never imagining that the same patient eye her mother had trained on her, the eye that could not look at a thing without wondering what it truly contained, would lead her fingers to a seam in old wood that should not have given, and from there to a truth that had been waiting 20 years for someone willing to look. Adelaide Voss never did become a wealthy woman, not by the measure most of Larkspur Hollow would have used to judge wealth, but she became, in the years that followed, something the town had badly needed and had not had in a long while. A person whose word, once doubted by everyone, was now trusted by everyone, precisely because she had proven, in the hardest possible way, that the truth mattered to her more than her own comfort. The coach itself she never sold and never fully retired, keeping it under its lean-to beside the house she built, weathered and patched and entirely hers, a standing reminder to anyone who asked that the things and the people the world is quickest to write off as worthless are very often the ones holding, quietly, inside them, everything that was missing. Thank you for spending this time with Adelaide and with us tonight. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need the reminder that worth doesn't announce itself loudly, and that the overlooked things, and the overlooked people, are so often carrying more than anyone bothered to notice. We'd love to hear your answer to this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.